So today's passage is pretty straightforward. But before we get to that, I'd like to talk about the message from Palm Sunday, because I especially enjoy that video message. And it was by Pastor Cheryl Kimball. And I feel like the passage today is a really good continuation of what she spoke about on Palm Sunday. And, you know, the story was Jesus needed a donkey to ride on in order to enter the town and fulfill the scriptures. And the disciples took the donkey just saying, Lord needs it. And then she led on to say, well, what does Lord need from us? Because she mentioned that Bible rarely mentions Lord needing something. And what she said was that Jesus made it clear that God's work wouldn't be complete without the work of the disciples after he was gone. And that same message to the disciples applied to us. Jesus showed the disciples that they can lead and follow Jesus faithfully, and that the work needs to continue today through us, through the believers. And as followers of Christ, it is now our turn to live as his followers. And she said to follow is to participate, meaning you can't just watch and think about things and decide things in your head. You have to make some sort of a choice and have some action follow out of that choice. So how do we follow Jesus like the disciples? She said we're either spectators or participants. And Jesus asked the disciples to be participants doing God's work, and he asked the same from us. And she reminded us the very well-known verse from Micah. What does the Lord require of you? And she said, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. And these all require participation from us. All of these are action things. And if we don't participate, we cannot do these things. And effectively, we become contributors to whatever problem we're witnessing. And in order to participate in the work of Jesus, she said we are to take up our cross and follow Jesus. So are we doing that? Or are we denying Christ? Are we betraying Christ by not doing that? And are we also afraid of truly following Christ? And she said, you have to make a decision. You have no business celebrating the resurrection if you're not willing to go to the cross, go to the cross and follow Jesus personally. And ultimately, that we need to take up our cross and follow Jesus. And that each of us personally need to figure out what that means. What does it mean for me? What does it mean for you to take the cross and follow Jesus? And she ended her message by imploring all of us to follow Christ this week and always, even through all of the pain, sorrow, suffering, and humiliation that the cross brought to Jesus and the cross will likely bring to each of us. And today's message is, today is the second Sunday of Easter. And typically, the messages on second Sunday of Easter are like one of three. There's the road to Emmaus, where the disciples are all like downtrodden, and they're gonna go home and give up everything, and until they meet Jesus, and then they're enlightened and they realize the resurrection really happened, and they decide to go back. There's also a lot of pastors speak about Apostle Peter being forgiven 3 times by Jesus for denying him 3 times. And mostly they're about the disciples who were weak and lost and not sure what to do, suddenly figuring out what they need to do, make a commitment, and then really becoming a whole bunch of different people. It's like, I don't follow baseball anymore, but when I followed baseball, I cheered on for the New York Mets. And New York Mets was a terrible team almost all the time. And one time I got to watch them on TV because I was homesick. They won it was the final game of the World Championship where the Boston team's mistake allowed the Mets to win that game and miraculously win the series. And so it was kind of like that last game, even without the mistake, the Mets were a completely different team from the way they played in the other seasons. And it's like that with the disciples, especially with Peter. We see them differently than the people we saw on the day Jesus died on the cross. Peter is no longer responding out of fear. So today's passage, disciples got called up before the Sanhedrin, which is like the ruling body, and they're saying, we told you not to preach about Jesus or teach about Jesus. Why do you still do that? And there's the implication that there's going to be some punishment and if they don't stop doing that. And what does Peter say? On verse 29, it says, Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than any human authority. And that's why I titled this message, Whom Shall We Obey? Do we obey God or human authority? And whenever I think about that, I think of Matthew 22, verses 15 through 22. And let me read that for you. You also know this story pretty well. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you're a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. And there are many interpretations, many range of interpretations on this passage. You could interpret it as, oh, Jesus was only talking about this material coin, physical thing that belonged to Caesar because Caesar's image was on it. So Jesus was right in saying, return to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, right? But anything that belongs to God is different. And some other interpretation could be, well, if anything that belongs to Caesar or to a ruler must be returned to that ruler, then ruler could make up any rules, and if that's the governing person, then you have to follow those decrees along with whatever we need to follow God. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. Mostly, we're going to follow secular things when it comes to a ruling government, and then to God and to life of faith, we're going to follow God. And there has to be some conflict in the middle. They can't be perfectly parallel. And, you know, if you're a truly faithful person who's trying to follow the teachings of Jesus, you're bound to run into some conflicts. And the passage that I read from Matthew 22, basically Jesus implying that there are, or he's telling us there are two kingdoms, at least while we're living on this earth. There's the kingdom of Caesar, and there's the kingdom of Christ. And we have obligations to both kingdoms. And if Caesar demands money, give it to him. But make sure you also give God what he demands. That's what Jesus is saying in that parable. And Caesar had perfect right to collect his denarius from the Jews because he minted those coins. He literally was the owner. But God, he minted all of us. And he gave us our souls with his breath. And so in a way, you can say, because he made us in his image and he created our souls with his breath, everything about us belongs to God, not just some coins with somebody's face on them. So I understand Jesus to say, give Caesar his due, give the ruling party their due, the temporary stuff of this world, but make sure to give God his due. And since God made all of us, all of our life is due back to God. And Paul says it this way in Romans 6. Offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness, as opposed to sin, which it talks about earlier in the verse. And this is what the disciples did in today's passage. And they clearly ran into a conflict between what human authority was requesting and what God wanted from them. Do we face this conflict between God and somebody like Caesar today? Answer is clearly, from my perspective, yes, because I said you can't avoid that conflict. And I don't know that it's just the material things. I mean, the parable worked out nicely because there was the denarius, and they specifically asked about Caesar's taxes, which were paid with that denarius coin. And so you could think, oh, Jesus was only talking about money and those specific coins. But I think that's way too narrow interpretation. It's really, the conflict comes from deciding how we should live our lives. Is it only God making demands on the decision we make in our lives? No. Every day, we have to decide to follow the rules of the world so that we are responsible citizens of whatever nation we live in. We have to work in the world and follow the human laws while at the same time trying to live as God would have us live. Jesus said, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The disciples understood that their whole life belonged to God and was no longer in fear of returning their lives to God, even if that meant pain, sorrow, suffering, and humiliation. For those of us who are citizens of this country, we have an allegiance to the United States. That weighed heavily on me when I became a citizen just before entering college, because I understood that when I became a citizen, I was no longer going to have allegiance to Korea, and I was going to have that same level of allegiance, or I was supposed to have that same level of allegiance to the United States. And I feel like a lot of that burden has gone away. So I must be truly a U.S. citizen at this point. As Christians, we have that kind of allegiance to God. Hopefully stronger allegiance. And if you're familiar with the history of the United States, there have been serious conflicts in what those two different types of allegiances required for the citizens between what Jesus taught us and what the government allowed or decreed as the law. And those conflicts have been becoming much more clear lately, not because they suddenly rose up out of the dirt, because they've been around, and it was not considered right for these conflicts to be expressed explicitly. But now, people are claiming the things that we used to have concerns about as being not problematic and being sound policies. So for example, I don't want to go too deep into this, but there's a severe attack on concept of DEI, right? Equity, what is the D part? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Before DEI, it was 3 other letters, and I remember the first one, not DEI. But the point of DEI was to ensure people aren't discriminated for whatever reason. And most people in the United States thought that was a good thing. But there's clearly a big, huge group in the United States that don't think that's necessarily a great thing. At least 40%, if you believe what the polls say. And so we have a government whose majority members, the leading members, including the president, are making many decisions that clearly go against the teachings of Jesus. And many of these people, including the president, claim to be Christians, but are not acting in any way in line with what Jesus taught us and what the recently deceased Pope tried to remind us during his life. Pope Francis was very unusual in that he wanted the Catholic Church and its works to be inclusive. Pope Francis said the Catholic Church should be an institution determined to take care of the problems of people and the great anxieties that tear the contemporary world apart. That it should be a church capable of bending down to every person, regardless of their beliefs or condition, and healing their wounds. And this is what it means to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly before God. And I believe Jesus would agree with the description for the Presbyterian Church's goal as well. I believe Jesus would also agree that most of the recent decisions and actions taken by the US government and its president do not lead to doing justice, loving kindness, and being humble before God. So what do we do in the context of that conflict? Pastor Cheryl said this in her sermon: in any situation, you're either a spectator or participant. If you're witnessing a situation that harms others and you remain silent, you're a spectator. But you're actually becoming a part of the problem by not doing anything, because you're allowing the oppressor to oppress the oppressed. The disciples came to this realization about the rule of the Pharisees and the truth of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Whatever happened to them after the resurrection, it woke them up. We have to follow what Jesus told us. We have to go out, make disciples, spread the good news of Jesus the Messiah to the ends of the earth. And they decided to do that. And we see in Acts, they're just completely different set of people. And in the end, all of them suffered for his name and died while doing his work. And as mentioned in the last verse in today's passage, they were happy that they were able to suffer for his name. We should make disciples. We should spread the good news. And our daily lives and the decisions that we make should also reflect the teachings of Jesus when we see a government acting against the interest of its citizens and our neighbors around the world. I believe we need to be participants in this conflict, not spectators. We need the conversion experience of the disciples that allowed them to become participants, just as the disciples experienced. Let us meet the resurrected Jesus and recognize that he is the Lord. However you typically go about doing that, let's do more of that. Receive forgiveness for the way we've been before, for the way we lived before. Acknowledge the Holy Spirit working within us, and seek the power of Jesus and the wisdom of the Holy Spirit as we try to overcome our fear, because the fear is real. There are a lot of people fearful in this country right now. When I go to attend a protest rally, even though I'm not doing anything big, I have this slight tinge of fear. What if? But that's why we need to seek the power of Jesus and the wisdom of the Holy Spirit as we try to overcome our fear, because we know as we carry our cross, there's going to be sorrow, pain, humility, and possibly other more painful things. But let us overcome our fear like the disciples did and focus on doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly before God. Let's pray.